Hello everyone, this is Cody Lee of BlackCatBooks.org, author of I, the Dragon, Cruel and Beautiful, Rabbit Hole, Lore and Frey, and the upcoming Jaw of the Dragon. So an interesting narrative I've been seeing tossed around since the release of Breath of the Wild, one that I haven't really talked about, one that I think has kind of been lurking underneath the surface in some of these like conspiratorial message boards, something that I think hasn't really been mainstream, but it's something that like has been put out there in a desperate attempt to downplay the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and that is the assertion that the game was inspired by Dark Souls, that Breath of the Wild took influence from FromSoftware's Dark Souls franchise and incorporated it into Breath of the Wild because Dark Souls was just so great, so influential that a franchise that has admittedly ripped off Zelda, was inspired by Zelda. I would hesitate to say ripped off. That was inspired by Zelda. You know, the Dark Souls director has confirmed that the Dark Souls general combat was inspired by like the Stalfos battles in Ocarina of Time. This is not a conspiracy. Like they are going to legit try and write off Breath of the Wild's success by saying that it copied Dark Souls because it's more difficult than other Zelda games. Now, the thing is, Zelda games have always been difficult, right? Like people forget this. People forget like the NES games are hard as hell. Like Zelda 2 is harder than any Souls game. It plays like a Souls game too. Like people forget that like this isn't all that unusual for the Zelda franchise to be like difficult. Breath of the Wild like really was just a product of the times, I think, because I think going from like 1998, like from the advent of 3D gaming to like especially the Wii years, like we were seeing a lot of people who had like never really played a game before, who were like trying to get into the habits, and like, you know, Nintendo was experimenting with ways to get them invested in the hobby, right? And it wasn't until recently, I would say like Breath of the Wild came out actually, that they managed to like create a formula that relatively works fairly well, right? In which they just throw you into like an open world setting like Breath of the Wild, you know, and just let you do whatever you want in it. So, you know, new players aren't really like turned off by it. They're not like stuck behind like ages of cutscenes, but skilled players can like really take advantage of the world like immediately and really get to explore everything and get to really get to understand just what the world has to offer. Like, again, this has been. It's interesting to see this argument put together online because Nintendo has actually been very, very forward about their actual inspirations for Breath of the Wild. Like, you know, they have confirmed that, yes, it was influenced by Skyrim. And because of how many people were insistent that Zelda should imitate Skyrim and be more like that, they took the idea of being an open world setting and did a lot more with it than Skyrim ever could. With like its paraglider and the mountain climbing, you can actually climb that mountain in Breath of the Wild. You have like the weapon throwing, you have like the crazy powers, you have the shield surfing, like everything in Breath of the Wild just comes together to create an absolute masterpiece, far beyond what Skyrim ever did. But never have Nintendo said that like they were influenced in any way by Dark Souls. And I have to ask, like, what exactly the difficulty was Nintendo influenced by when it comes to Dark Souls? Like, there really isn't all that much to say about it, honestly. Like, you know, you have like the weapons you can obtain in the overworld, but that's standard for any open world game. Like you have the vague fantasy aspect, but again, Zelda's always been fantasy. If anything, like if you're going to talk about like Dark Souls and if you're going to talk about like inspirations between these two games, like I would really prefer you talking about how Dark Souls was influenced by Zelda, because you can clearly see more of a Zelda influence in Elder Scrolls, in FromSoftware's design. Like, I think Elden Ring was specifically influenced by Breath of the Wild, right? Like, again, like, but fanboys, the FromSoftware fanboys are trying to pretend it's the other way around because they really want to create this illusion that, like, FromSoftware is, like, bigger than Nintendo and can, like, put out better games and that, like, Zelda can't compete with Elden Ring, which is going to be laughable when Tears of the Kingdom comes out. But, like, they're really pushing this angle really, really, really hard. And it's just not going to stick, honestly. Like, it reminds me a lot of like The Witcher 3 and how like the DLC came out and people were like pretending for a good while that like, oh man, this is the game of the year 2016, right? Like it's going to result in the same thing, I think. Hyping up From Software the way they have is that eventually From Software is going to lose all the talent. And eventually it's going to go the way of Capcom, of Square Enix, of all these other like non-Nintendo companies where they just stop making games and are just kind of reliant on their like their previous successes. Like From Software is basically going through the same process that like Square Enix and Capcom went through in the 90s, right? Where they become overly reliant on the PlayStation and Xbox ecosystem, and then they just kind of collapse just by, putting out the same thing over and over and over again. It is very much unlike what Nintendo does, in which they constantly innovate, constantly do new things, constantly evolve, and constantly do new original things with their IPs. Tears of the Kingdom, what from Tears of the Kingdom looks like it was inspired by Elden Ring at all? Like everything from Tears of the Kingdom, like people are making jokes about like nuts and bolts, but first of all, nuts and bolts didn't have an open world. It didn't have you it wasn't a real platformer like the first two games. Like Tears of the Kingdom seems a lot more organic. It seems like it's a lot more implemented into the general game design. It looks far superior than Nuts and Bolts ever will, right? And from that basis alone, like you should like really respect and admire what Tears of the Kingdom has done. By the way, I really need to play Nuts and Bolts. But I see no influences from Dark Souls in Zelda. Like, I wouldn't want influences from Dark Souls in Zelda. Like, I think From Software is one of the worst things to happen to modern gaming because just people won't stop gushing about the fact that, like, oh, they're an actual video game company, like, as opposed to The Last of Us. Like, again, like, it's the same thing we got with Mass Effect, with The Witcher 3, with Skyrim back in the day. Like you just get you get a lot of plebs like who get excited at the prospect of like, oh man, look at all this technology in this game, and they don't really actually play it. That's the Elden Ring fan base. That's the Witcher fan base. That's the Skyrim fan base. That's the Mass Effect fan base. That's like the Final Fantasy VII fan base, right? Like, how many of these people who say they love these games actually play the games? Like, I imagine it's not very much, right? But Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo in general, has fans. It has players. It has dedicated audiences waiting with bated breath for the release of Tears of the Kingdom, and not a single one of them, myself included, will be thinking about Elden Ring while they play this brand new masterpiece from Nintendo.